FDR and the New Deals. Lecture terms. The first New Deal. Focus question. What were the major policy initiatives of the New Deal in the 100 days? FDR and the 1932 election. Paradoxically, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known as FDR, raised in privilege on a New York country estate, came to symbolically represent the ordinary American citizen. Like Lincoln, FDR's greatness was his capacity to reject traditional ideas while confronting a national crisis. FDR was born in 1882, a fifth cousin to Theodore Roosevelt. He graduated from Harvard and served in the New York State Legislature as an undersecretary of the Navy in World War I. After he ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, he contracted the disease polio, and he lost the use of his legs, a fact concealed from the public in the pre-television era. Very few Americans realized that this powerful president was confined to a wheelchair. In his speech accepting the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, Roosevelt promised a, quote, New Deal for the American people. But his campaign offered few specific proposals. Roosevelt discussed government's responsibility to ensure that every man had a, quote, right to make a comfortable living. But he also wanted a balanced federal budget and criticized Hoover for excessive federal spending. The biggest difference between Hoover and FDR's campaigns was the Democrats' call to repeal prohibition. Americans desperately wanted new leadership. Roosevelt won an overwhelming 57% of the popular vote, and Democrats gained a majority in both houses of Congress. The coming of the first New Deal. The Depression provoked different responses across the globe. For most of the 1930s, conservative governments ruled in Britain and France, and they did little to resolve the crisis. In Germany, Adolf Hitler of the Nazi Party established one of the most brutal dictatorships in human history, banning all political opposition and terrorizing the Jews. In the Soviet Union, the tyrannical Joseph Stalin launched 5-year plans that industrialized that nation and allegedly eliminated unemployment, but at great social cost, as well as great cost in lives. Japan's militarist government invaded China in 1937 and aspired to dominate all of Asia. Roosevelt envisioned the New Deal as an alternative to socialism, fascism, and unregulated capitalism. He wanted to reconcile the idea of democracy, the idea of individual liberty, and the idea of economic planning together. He did not begin his first term as president with a full-fledged plan. He initially depended on a group of intellectuals and social workers who took key positions in his administration. These included Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, who was a veteran of Hull House and the New York Consumers League. Also, Harry Hopkins, who directed emergency relief during Roosevelt's term as New York's governor. Also, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, a veteran of Theodore Roosevelt's progressive campaign of 1912. And also Louis Brandeis, who had advised Woodrow Wilson in 1912 and now advised FDR while serving on the Supreme Court. Although these individuals represented the influence of progressivism on Roosevelt and his New Deal, they had no unified position. Brandeis, for one, thought large corporations not only were too powerful, but had contributed to the Depression by keeping prices artificially high and limiting workers' purchasing power. He argued that they should be broken up, not regulated. Yet the Brains Trust, a group of academics that included a number of Columbia University professors, thought bigness was inevitable in a modern economy. They believed the competitive marketplace had disappeared and that large firms should be managed and directed by the government rather than be broken up completely. Their view most decisively shaped what came to be known as the first New Deal. The banking crisis. FDR realized that Americans needed leadership and action immediately. And when he took office on March 4, 1933, he acted quickly. He started a campaign of reassuring Americans and restoring their confidence. At his inauguration, he declared that, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." His first step was to confront a banking system that was about to collapse. Banks that had invested funds in the stock market were failing. And by March of 1933, banking was suspended in most states. Roosevelt declared a, quote, "bank holiday," temporarily halting all bank operations. And he also called a special session of Congress, which on March 9th passed the Emergency Banking Act to provide funds to the endangered banks. Additional measures transformed the American financial system. The Glass-Steagall Act barred commercial banks from buying and selling stocks, and until its repeal in the 1990s, it helped to prevent many irresponsible practices that had led to the stock market crash in 1929. The same law established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured the accounts of individual depositors. Roosevelt also took the United States off the gold standard, thus breaking the link between the nation's currency and the gold reserves. This made it possible to issue more money and to stimulate business activity. These efforts together saved the financial system and greatly increased the government's power over it. While 5,000 banks had failed between 1929 and 1933, which was a full third of the total banks in the United States, not one bank failed in 1936. The 100 Days. The Banking Acts were the first of a series of laws in the first 3 months of FDR's administration, a period known as the 100 Days. Roosevelt used the crisis and his electoral mandate to pressure Congress into passing laws to stimulate the economy. Congress established a plethora of what were called alphabet agencies, such as the National Recovery Administration, NRA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. To direct the recovery, these were put in place. Never had an American president exercised such power or so quickly expanded the role of the federal government in American lives as had FDR in his first 100 days. The key to Roosevelt's plan for recovery was the National Industrial Recovery Act. This was largely based on the government-business partnership created by the War Industries Board during World War I. The law established a National Recovery Administration, the NRA, to set industry codes with groups of business leaders that would be guidelines for output, prices, and working conditions. This, it was hoped, would end the cutthroat competition that drove companies out of business. In part, it was thought that by exempting these industry-wide agreements from antitrust laws, this could be accomplished. FDR thus efficiently and effectively repudiated an older idea of liberty based on the belief that the best way to encourage economic activity and to ensure a fair distribution of wealth was to allow market competition to unfold free from government interference. This policy was also known as laissez-faire economics. What Roosevelt proposed was something quite different than laissez-faire. To win support from labor on his ideas, Section 7A of the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, recognized workers' rights to organize unions. This was a sharp departure of the open shop policies of the 1920s, and instead a move toward what was called industrial freedom. The NRA soon adopted codes that set standards for production, prices, and wages in the textile, steel, mining, and auto industries. The agency launched a publicity campaign to promote itself and its symbol, the Blue Eagle. This was displayed in stores and factories affected by those codes. But the NRA became controversial when it was shown to have allowed large companies to dominate the code writing process. Large corporations and companies raised prices, limited production, laid off workers, and divided markets among themselves at the expense of smaller competitors. Many anti-union companies ignored Section 7A. The agency lacked the personnel to enforce the 750 codes throughout the nation by 1935. The NRA did not create recovery or cooperation between capital and labor. The 100 Days also saw government relief to the needy. Roosevelt and most of his advisors believed that direct government payments to the unemployed could erode individual self-reliance, and they did not want that. So the Economy Act reduced federal spending in the hopes of winning business support. But with nearly 25% unemployment, relief spending became inevitable. In May of 1933, Congress established the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to make grants to local relief agencies. But FDR preferred to create temporary jobs that would decrease unemployment while improving the nation's infrastructure of roads, bridges, public buildings, and public parks. In March 1933, Congress established the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This will set unemployed young men to work on projects like forest preservation and the improvement of national parks and wildlife preserves. By its end in 1942, the CCC had employed more than 3 million people and had provided what FDR referred to as, quote, a hand up, not a hand out. Public works and problems. The NIRA also created the Public Works Administration, or PWA, and it funded it with $3.3 billion, directed by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes. Harold Ickes and the PWA worked to build roads, schools, hospitals, and other public facilities. In November 1933, the Civil Works Administration, CWA, was also launched, and in a few months, it employed more than 4 million people in constructing highways, tunnels, courthouses, and airports. But the costs of these agencies soon skyrocketed, and criticisms mounted that the New Deal was creating a class of Americans permanently dependent on government jobs. In response, FDR dismantled the CWA. Other public works projects involved government-planned economic transformation, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. The TVA built dams to prevent floods along the Tennessee River Valley and provide cheap electricity in a region with many isolated and rustic households. The TVA, for the first time, had the federal government producing electricity in competition with private companies, and it served as a model for regional planning that would economically develop the West. The 100 Days also included efforts to improve conditions for farmers. The aforementioned Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA, let the government try to raise farm prices by establishing production quotas for major crops and by paying farmers not to plant more than that quota. Many crops ultimately were destroyed, and most controversially, 6 million pigs were slaughtered in order to create demand to make prices go up. The AAA successfully raised farm prices and farm incomes as a result of these policies. But large farmers benefited the most, and few small farmers, the tenant farmers, and as well as the agricultural laborers, received assistance. Few of them benefited from these policies. The AAA policies actually encouraged the eviction of tenant farmers, many of whom took to the roads and migrated to the West Coast in search of work. The beginning, in 1930, of unusually dry weather in the Midwest also worsened the Depression's effect on rural America. By the mid-1930s, the most severe drought in the nation's history caused soil that had deteriorated from modern farming methods to simply blow away in the wind. This created what was known as the Dust Bowl, as areas in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado were all affected. The drought and storms displaced more than 1 million farmers, whose massive trek to the Pacific coast was captured in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath. The New Deal and government growth. By the late 1920s, home ownership had become a sign of respectability among the middle class, and it offered security to workers who faced low wages, irregular employment, and limited occupational mobility. The Depression destroyed the American housing industry. The building of new homes virtually halted, and banks and savings and loans associations that financed home ownership collapsed or survived only by foreclosing on mortgages. President Hoover had established a federally sponsored bank to issue home loans, but only with the New Deal did the federal government systematically intervene in the housing market. Roosevelt stated that, quote, the security of the home was a fundamental right. In 1933 and 1934, his administration undertook efforts to protect homeowners from foreclosure and to stimulate new construction. The Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, insured millions of long-term mortgages issued by private banks. The government also built thousands of units of low-rent housing for people to purchase or to rent. Thanks to the FHA and later the Veterans Administration, home ownership became a reality for tens of millions of families. In FDR's first 2 years, the 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition was ratified. Also, the Federal Communications Commission was established to supervise radio and telephone communications. Also, the Securities and Exchange Commission was created to regulate stock and bond markets. The first New Deal was a series of experiments, some of which failed, but many which will help to transform the role of the federal government. Many of these policies also assisted millions of Americans in the midst of the Great Depression. But it did not end the Depression. In 1934, 10 million Americans, more than 20% of the labor force, were still out of work. In 1935, the Supreme Court, still dominated by conservative Republican judges who believed in 19th century notions of freedom, such as liberty of contract, began to strike down New Deal laws. The NRA was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because its codes and regulations delegated legislative powers to the President and attempted to regulate local businesses not engaged in interstate commerce. In January 1936, the Supreme Court also killed the AAA, which it declared an unconstitutional use of congressional power over local economic activity in the agricultural sector. In June 1936, the Supreme Court ruled that New York could not set a minimum wage for women and children. The grassroots revolt. Focus question: who were the main proponents of economic justice, and what measures did they advocate? Labor's great upheaval. Perhaps the most dramatic development of the mid-1930s was the organization of millions of workers into unions in the mass production industries that had successfully resisted unionization in the past. Called Labor's Great Upheaval, this unprecedented militancy was unexpected. This time, the federal government seemed to side with workers through the NIRA and the Wagner Act of 1935. The Wagner Act gave workers the legal right to form unions. With the drastic reduction of European immigration, cultural differences between workers were less important. American-born children of the new immigrants now dominated the workforce. Militant socialists and communists with years of experience in organizing ultimately provided leadership to this labor movement. American factories were small tyrannies in which unions were rare. Workers could be assaulted by supervisors and fired at will. Managers were the ones that determined the length of a workday, as well as the speed of assembly lines. Most local governments had supported the employers. Workers, however, demanded more than just higher wages in the 1930s. They wanted an end to employers' arbitrary rules and basic civil liberties for workers. They wanted things such as the right to picket, the right to hand out literature, and the right to meet and discuss grievances. All of these required union recognition. Roosevelt's election inspired those who hoped to end, quote, industrial despotism. In 1934, labor revolted. 2,000 strikes broke out across the country, including violent, massive strikes in Toledo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. Only a huge nationwide strike of textile workers failed to achieve any of its goals. This upheaval challenged the AFL's old model of organizing workers by craft skill rather than organizing all workers in a particular industry, such as steel, into one union. When the AFL convention in 1935 refused an appeal by 30 AFL leaders for the creation of industrial unions, John L. Lewis, who was the head of the United Mine Workers, forced a split that led to the creation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. The CIO, Lewis said, would win, quote, economic freedom and industrial democracy for American workers. In 1936 December, the United Auto Workers, a small CIO union, conducted a sit-down strike, occupying a General Motors plant in Cleveland, Ohio. Soon, such strikes spread to GM factories in Flint, Michigan as well. Strikers defended the plants from police attacks, and Michigan's governor refused to send troops to break the strike. In February 1937, GM capitulated and recognized the United Auto Workers Union. Ford did not recognize the UAW until 1941, but by then the UAW had hundreds of thousands of members. The triumph in auto spread to the steel industry, which recognized unions by 1938. By 1940, around 9 million workers were in unions, double the number from 1930. Unions won rights to influence management decisions and gained new grievance and seniority procedures. Labor and politics. Unlike the AFL, the CIO embraced positive government intervention in labor management affairs. It presented a program for federal economic and social policy, including public housing, universal health care, and unemployment and old age insurance. The CIO built on the increasingly popular idea that prosperity would rise from an American standard of living for all Americans based on mass consumption, and argued that the Depression was caused by the highly unequal distribution of wealth and income. By mid-decade, many New Dealers accepted this under-consumptionist explanation of the Depression, which saw lack of effective consumer demand as its cause. Other popular movements in the mid-1930s emphasized economic justice. In California, novelist Upton Sinclair won the Democratic nomination for governor in 1934. He did this as the head of the organization End Poverty in California. He called for the state to form industrial and farm cooperatives to create jobs. One of the nation's first modern, quote, negative campaigns, however, cost him the election. To the contrary, Huey Long of Louisiana, representing the state's populist and socialist traditions and its undemocratic politics, rose to power as governor in 1928 and then became a U.S. Senator in 1930. He used his power to build roads, schools, and hospitals, and he heavily taxed oil companies. Called the Kingfish, Long, in 1934, launched the, quote, Share Our Wealth movement, which called for confiscating the wealth of the richest Americans in order to finance an immediate grant of $5,000 and guaranteed job and annual income for all citizens. Long claimed to have 5 million followers. He was about to declare a run for president in 1935 when he was assassinated. Dr. Francis Townsend, a California physician, won support for his plan for the government to make monthly payments of $200 to older Americans, with the requirement that they spend it immediately to boost the economy. No putting it in savings, in other words. By 1934, 2 million had joined what were called the Townsend Clubs. Many religious leaders of various denominations connected to the general public through mass media outlets during this era. Ironically, many fundamentalists used the most modern communication outlets to promote their anti-modernist messages. For example, in the mid-1930s, Father Charles E. Coughlin, known as the, quote, radio priest, attracted millions of listeners each week with broadcasts attacking Wall Street bankers and greedy capitalists. Initially a supporter of FDR, Coughlin soon became increasingly critical of what he saw as a failed New Deal. His crusade later shifted to anti-Semitism and support for European fascism. The Second New Deal. Focus question. What were the major initiatives of the Second New Deal? The WPA and the Wagner Act. These popular movements and the CIO helped create the Second New Deal, launched by Roosevelt in 1935. And this was buoyed by Democratic gains in Congress in 1934. The first New Deal had focused on economic recovery. The Second New Deal was centered on economic security, meaning the guarantee that government would protect Americans from unemployment and poverty. The belief that a lack of consumer demand caused the Depression had become popularized by politicians like Long, Townsend, as well as the CIO itself. By 1935, many New Dealers believed government should no longer try to stimulate business recovery, but rather it should redistribute income in order to sustain mass purchasing power in the consumer economy. Congress imposed a tax on large fortunes and corporate profits, and they eventually created the Rural Electrification Agency, the REA, to bring electricity to homes, thus enabling rural Americans to purchase household appliances. The REA brought electricity to millions of homes and was one of the most successful New Deal programs. The federal government also tried to promote soil conservation and family farming, as policymakers believed that prosperity was impossible when the farmer's standard of living lagged behind that of urban workers and the middle class. In 1934, FDR had limited federal employment programs, but now he established what was called a Works Progress Administration, the WPA. This hired 3 million Americans each year until it ended in 1943. Directed by Harry Hopkins, the WPA transformed the American landscape. It built thousands of public buildings, bridges, roads, airports, stadiums, public swimming pools, and sewage treatment plants. The WPA even employed white-collar professionals. The most famous WPA projects were in the arts and included murals, historical and tourist guidebooks, and the federal theater and dance projects. In 1935, Congress also created a National Youth Administration to provide relief to American teenagers and young adults. The Wagner Act was another major Second New Deal measure. It democratized the American workplace by empowering a National Labor Relations Board to supervise elections in which employees voted on union representation. Sponsored by Senator Robert Wagner of New York, the bill also made illegal, quote, unfair labor practices, such as firing and blacklisting union organizers that stymied organization in the past. Collective bargaining was redefined as a crucial element of American freedom, and now legally protected, it would offer workers a mechanism by which they could win higher wages and thus contribute to the recovery. The American welfare state. The Social Security Act was the most important element of the Second New Deal. It represented Roosevelt's belief that the government had to guarantee the material well-being of ordinary Americans. It established a system of unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and aid to the disabled, elderly poor, and families with dependent children. Though these programs built on old progressive proposals, this was a permanent system of social insurance embarked upon by the United States government. The Social Security Act created the American version of the welfare state, a term with origins in World War II era Britain that referred to income assistance, medical care, and social services provided for citizens by the government. Although unprecedented in American history, the American welfare state, compared to welfare states in Europe, was more decentralized, spent less, and covered fewer citizens. The original Social Security bill contained a system of national health insurance that was eliminated after vehement opposition by the American Medical Association, which feared government regulation of doctors' incomes and practices. While some New Dealers wanted a universal program funded by general tax revenues with a single set of eligibility standards administered by federal officers, Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins and powerful congressmen wanted to keep relief in state and local hands instead of the federal governments. They also wanted to make workers contribute to the costs of their own benefits. FDR wanted Social Security taxes to come from employers and workers rather than general revenues in order to give working citizens a, quote, legal, moral, and political right to collect their old age pensions and unemployment benefits. Congress would not dare violate this. Thus, Social Security became a mixture of national and local funding. It was also a mixture of control and eligibility standards. Old age pensions were administered nationally, but paid for by taxes on workers and employers. These taxes also paid for unemployment insurance, but this was decentralized, allowing states to set up unemployment benefit levels. The states paid most of the cost for direct poor relief in a program called Aid to Dependent Children, and eligibility and payment varied greatly from state to state. Social Security was a significant departure from American government's traditional function, and the Second New Deal dramatically changed the relationship between the federal government and American citizens. Before the 1930s, Americans asked whether the government should intervene in the economy. After the New Deal, Americans asked only how the government should intervene. And this still applies today. A reckoning with liberty. Focus question. How did the New Deal recast the meaning of American freedom? 1936 election. Free enterprise versus socialized liberty. The Depression ensured that Americans would face, in the words of one writer, a reckoning with liberty. FDR declared that for too many Americans, quote, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real, men no longer followed the pursuit of happiness, end quote. Most Americans assumed that liberty required a new meaning. The New Deal transformed the idea of freedom by tying it to the growing power of the national government. Roosevelt was not just a master politician, but a brilliant communicator. And with his opponent controlling most newspapers, he turned instead to the radio to reach Americans with weekly broadcasts called fireside chats to build support for his policies. FDR adopted old terms and ideas to defend his innovative policies, most notably the term liberalism, which he redefined as large, active, and socially conscious government. In his second fireside chat, Roosevelt contrasted the older notion of liberty as liberty of contract, which served only, quote, the privileged few, contrasting it to his definition of liberty as, quote, greater security for the average man, end quote. He continued to positively associate freedom with economic security and identify economic inequality as its greatest foe. Yet liberty, defined as freedom from powerful government, animated his opponents in this election. They argued that New Deal spending undermined fiscal responsibility and that new regulations ultimately suppressed American freedom. Conservative businessmen and politicians formed an organization to oppose the policies of FDR, called the American Liberty League. As the 1930s went on, FDR's opponents increasingly employed the language of liberty to paint FDR as a dictator who threatened traditional American freedoms. By 1936, politics reflected class divisions more than at any other point in American history. Working class voters provided large majorities for the Democratic Party, and large and small businessmen were alienated from the New Deal. Americans divided over their definition of liberty completely. One magazine editor said that citizens had two opposing concepts of liberty, one based on free enterprise, and the other on, quote, socialized liberty, which was based on an equality of wealth and goods. A fight over the ideal of freedom defined the 1936 presidential campaign. The Democrats insisted that in a modern economy, the government is obliged to guarantee, quote, a democracy of opportunity for all. Roosevelt, in his speech accepting the nomination, attacked, quote, economic royalists who intended to establish a tyranny over ordinary people. He insisted that economic rights were the precondition for liberty, and that poor men, quote, are not free men. FDR argued that large corporations constituted a, quote, new despotism that threatened economic freedom. FDR faced the Republican nominee and former Kansas Governor Alfred Landon, who denounced Social Security and other New Deal programs as a threat to individual liberty. Roosevelt, however, won by a landslide, carrying every state except for Maine and Vermont. Strong support from organized labor and his ability to unite Southern white and Northern black voters, also Protestant farmers and urban Catholic and Jewish ethnics, and industrial workers and middle-class homeowners, won FDR the election. These groups formed the so-called New Deal coalition that dominated American politics for the next 50 years. A reckoning with liberty. At his inauguration, FDR admitted that the Depression was not over and promised to do more to help the significant minority of Americans still in need of assistance. Encouraged by his massive victory, Roosevelt committed what many believed was an enormous error, arguing that several Supreme Court justices were, quote, too old to perform their functions. He proposed that the president himself be allowed to appoint a new justice for each who remained on the court past the age of 70. This was 6 justices at that particular time. FDR's goal was to change the balance of power on a Supreme Court that might invalidate his Social Security Act or the Wagner Act or other parts of the Second New Deal. Immediately, FDR was criticized as an aspiring dictator. Congress rejected the plan, but Roosevelt's court-packing threat seemed to persuade the Supreme Court to work with him instead of against him. They accepted economic regulation by the state and federal governments. The Supreme Court soon upheld a minimum wage law. It also affirmed federal power to regulate wages, hours, child labor, and it also rejected challenges to Social Security and the Wagner Act. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes said that while, quote, freedom of contract did not appear in the Constitution, quote, liberty did, and liberty required legal protections against social evils that menace the people's welfare. The Second New Deal slowed after the court-packing fight. Although the Housing Act, passed in 1937, signaled the first major effort to build homes for the poorest in America, the Fair Labor Standards Bill languished in Congress for a year before it passed in 1938. This banned goods produced by child labor, setting a minimum wage and requiring overtime pay for more than 40 hours of work per week. This established federal regulation of wages and working conditions, which was a radical departure from pre-Depression policies. In 1937, the economy slumped sharply after FDR, who saw economic improvements in 1936, had decreased federal farm and WPA work relief. This caused business investment, production, and stocks to also fall and unemployment to rise once again. In 1936, in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interests, and Money, John Maynard Keynes, an economist, criticized other economists' commitment to, quote, balanced budgets. Instead, Keynes argued that massive government spending was needed, even at the cost of deficits, in order to sustain purchasing power and stimulate economic activity during downturns. By 1938, Roosevelt adopted this solution, known as Keynesian economics, and he asked Congress for billions more dollars in work relief and farm aid. The New Deal had shifted from economic planning to economic redistribution, and then to public spending. The Second New Deal was over.